you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and you're here for another episode of Yes and. And we've taken a break recently from Yes and we're finally starting to get some new episodes back out into the world. Hopefully, there's been enough of a break from the podcast that we can start having some non-COVID conversations in the world. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. Our guest today is a return guest. It's Dr. Erin Smith. And Dr. Smith was on the show a little over a year ago to talk about STEM schools. And if you watch that episode, then you remember that Dr. Smith is, Dr. Smith is an author. He's an active and leading STEM school director and a professional speaker with expertise in workplace readiness. Erin assists schools, corporate supporters, and community leaders to collaborate so education professionals understand the needs of the businesses. And he really is promoting a school to workforce pipeline instead of the school to prison pipeline, which I absolutely love about your work. He's also the author of Awakening Your STEM School. And today we're going to talk about his newly released book, Blank Check. What if you were asked to reinvent public education? And this is a young adult novel designed to inspire a new generation and the current generations of us parents to become involved with fixing the public school system in America. Dr. Smith, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's really an honor to be back, and I'm excited.
Yes, me too. And thank you for sending me an advanced reader copy of Blank Check. I've really enjoyed reading it. So I think, and like I said, I was hoping to have some non-COVID conversations, and I do think that the pandemic right now is a good segue into this because I really think the situation that we are in currently has shown us very clearly just what a house of cards our school systems are. It's showing us not just with our school systems, but with systems across the board, like our whole entire economy, our whole entire society, for everything to have this much of an impact in such a short period of time that is so detrimental. We're living in a house of cards and the illusion is poof. So
Incredible.
Yeah, it is. It really is. So can you talk a little bit about, what are some of the problems that you see that led to this vision of a new type of school system?
Well, I think everybody knows that education is not perfect. Mm-hmm. But what I'm sensing more and more is that there's a lot of disconnects. We have a broken system, let's call it like it is, mm-hmm. And through no fault of anybody, when you continue to work with a broken system and you don't make changes, it's not going to improve. It's ultimately going to deteriorate and implode. Here's a case in point. We have kids who forget the material they learned in June and then transition back into September. So you're talking about at least 5 or 6 weeks for a teacher to get back on track in terms of learning, structures, and things like that. 3 centuries ago, that was done predominantly to help farmers and agriculture. Mm-hmm. And the majority of Americans are not on farmlands. Right. So why don't we make adjustments and utilize that time in the summer to do things such as exploring careers, mm-hmm. such as continuing the base of skills. where teachers have the availability to keep connecting real life experiences with kids. Mm-hmm. And that's just one example. You know, we could go on and on. We've got teachers that are overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. They are literally consumed with the stress already with tests, mm-hmm. the mandates of the state requirements to teach all this curriculum combined with testing, the lack of resources. Unfortunately, we don't get the parental support we always need. And it has become a perfect storm.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we decided that it's time for a change, mm-hmm. and to change the way we view education, but to approach it from a fictional perspective. Mm-hmm. If you look at it from a nonfiction perspective, you've got to think about all this legislation, budget restrictions, mm-hmm. and things that handcuff the possibilities. But writing it as a young adult book and a fiction book, you're only bound by your imagination.
Right. Right, exactly. And I love some of the things that you point out in the book that are problems with the current system, uninspired leadership, mm-hmm. or the fact that a lot of the decision makers who are making policy decisions that directly affect our students, our communities, our schools, our families, have no flipping idea what's going on in the public schools, and they send their own children to private schools because they know that there's a problem in a lot of areas in the public schools. So there's this huge disconnect between the decisions they're making in the schools. Yes. I loved the phrase that you put in the one scene, as Josiah was quitting his job, when he talked about conflict avoidant cowards. Man, oh man, isn't that a problem in our schools? Not just in our schools, but in society in general. You addressed and mentioned the school to prison pipeline, which mm-hmm. is what a lot of our schools have become, especially urban schools. Yes. They really have, and even in some rural schools, where you have some of those traumatized, like so-called problem children. The school administrators who tend to be yes men and suck ups. So there are just so many things that I really think that you've addressed in here. And I think I really think it's important to talk about some of these things. So how would you overcome, just like the decision makers who don't know what's going on in the schools and the uninspired leadership? Like how do you propose overcoming that?
You have to invite them into your schools. And I say this with my hat in hand. The legislators don't need to see the best schools. They need to see what every school looks like. They actually need to be a teacher for a week or a month and take the work home, make the phone call to the parents, and understand the rigmarole that they go through on a day-to-day experiences. You will never appreciate somebody's perspective of things unless you actually have endured it. Mm-hmm. I will never understand what it's like to serve our country, but I can only imagine how hard it is for them. Mm-hmm. And I want people to realize the same thing. Being a teacher, you're doing so many things at once. You're putting out fires. You're literally being a counselor. You are becoming a parent of sorts. You're a mentor. You're a career aspirer. Mm-hmm. And you've got to get people aware of the situation. And you have to put them in there for an amount of time so that they actually understand that this is not the same that it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We have kids that are smarter now, but part of the problem is they're more distracted. They have social media that they can flip in a second. Mm-hmm. They have other problems now that didn't really happen 30 and 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And until we raise this awareness and we start talking about it as an active community, we're never going to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
When you address the school to prison pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people don't understand when kids drop out of school, you're talking about approximately $293,000 of economic tax base that they contribute to their community.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of money that can help any community.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the rural that doesn't have a lot. You're talking about urban. And then within the urban, the impoverished areas that really are suffering because, number one, they don't have a champion to help guide them through the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I think your book addresses, not directly, but indirectly, just by the title, Blank Check, like what if you had a donor, a philanthropist or a benefactor who was just a bottomless pit of money who wanted to back this. Okay, that's kind of like the ideal. And at the same time, we've got our schools that are funded by real estate taxes in this country. And so how can we shift that? Because there's a lot of inequality that comes just from how our schools are currently funded.
You do this in a number of ways. And I think everybody has to understand that it doesn't always get solved with money.
Mm-hmm.
Part of our partners that we have, I know not to ask for money because I know they can't afford it. Mm-hmm. But the resources that they can bring in, whether it's guidance, mentoring, even internships, that's still part of answering the problem. Mm-hmm. Education has to understand what the business needs are, and they have to feel comfortable in owning up and saying, this is where we're disconnected at. How can we help you fill these jobs with qualified employees? Mm-hmm. 4 out of 10 kids leave their area because there's no job that interests them. So they're losing the tax base right there. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the disconnect is they're not communicating with one another. Mm-hmm. We don't have parents that are actively engaged with schools. And I get it. We have parents who work 2 and 3 jobs. But when I say engaged, I want them to be a phone call away. I don't want them to hide behind emails. I want them to feel like they're a part of their child's education and not as if we're doing it all by ourselves.
Right. Well, the younger generation of parents that are starting to have children now or do have young children in school, how do you get them to pick up the phone when they won't even answer the phone when their friends call? If it's not a text, they look at their phone in horror, like, I can't believe you're calling me. How do you get engagement from that mentality and from that generation?
You have to build a relationship with them. You have to show that you care for them just as much as you care for their children. Mm-hmm. And you have to let them see the human side of you. You have to make them feel like you've known them for years and you keep inviting them to the table.
Okay.
Until that happens and they don't have that trust built up, mm-hmm. they're not going to do anything. They're actually going to be really, why are you doing this? What do you want? Yep. Instead of really coming to the table. Thank you. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in poverty-related areas. You have special needs students where parents don't understand the process, so they just go through the motions. And that's an important time for the teachers, the administrators to ask the parents questions. Do you understand what this means? Do you think this will work at home? What suggestions do you have to bring to the table to make these improvements? Mm-hmm. And it slowly shows them the different side of teaching. It shows the compassion. It shows the empathy. And it also shows that you want all kids to be well-rounded, not only in the academic world, but also as a person and as a citizen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And okay, that makes sense. And another question I have where I felt maybe, I don't know how to address this. I don't know how you would. What I do know as a trauma specialist is that I believe every school in the country faces this issue and it's a hidden issue. How do you address domestic violence? You know that some of your students are showing up and they live with abusive parents. And a lot of times that abuse is hidden with neglect and emotional abuse. You get unintentional neglect and poverty situations where parents are working 2 and 3 jobs just to hold it together. So the neglect comes in with the kids just having to hold it together on their own while mom's at work. And it's not like they're bad parents. It's a bad situation, and they're doing everything they can to hold their crap together. How can we address that a little bit better? Because it's just like ignore it and it'll go away almost in a lot of schools.
It'll never go away, and it creates a generational issue.
Yes.
Generational poverty.
Yes.
Unfortunately, cycles of domestic assaults and impoverishment. I always tell teachers, look for the signs, look for the body cues. And I'm not talking about bruises. Sometimes they're there. Most of the time, like you said, it's a little bit of neglect there. And that's where you build that relationship with the child and you say, are you okay? And once they feel comfortable in talking to you, that's when you have the information to take it to the next step. In Virginia, as I'm sure it is in a lot of other cases, if child neglect or child, what's the word I'm thinking of? Endangerment is a possibility in the realm of things. By law, we have to report that to CPS, Child Protective Services. Now, if we know it's a situation where, let's just say, single mom working 3 jobs, and the brother's in high school having to keep up everything, that's where you could bring in a social worker to go in and see what kind of supports that they could bring in from the city or even the school to aid in some of those things. You also have opportunities with crisis counselors, career coaches, and psychologists who all work together in situations that they're specialized in to do. And like you said, you never want to turn away if you suspect something, because chances are if you feel like something is, it is. You just have to see what's going on and you have to listen to their backstory.
Yeah. And I'm remembering in the book, because what this goes into the shame and the blame, that culture of shame. And there is a culture of shame around our lifestyles, especially if somebody's living in poverty or, at or below the poverty line. There's a societal and a collective shame that comes from that. And there were several times in the book whenever I was just reminded of Brene Brown's work. Brene Brown talks about the culture of shame and how we subtly shame other people, especially if they don't agree with us, just some of the backhanded, veiled insults and things like that we do to people, and bringing it out into the open and talking about it. And I love your suggestion of even having the schools or social workers interject to try to help, because right now, if a social worker shows up at your door, it doesn't feel like help. It feels like you're in trouble. It feels like you're going to be hauled off in handcuffs because you're a bad parent. And so I really think we need to kind of shift that whole attitude that we have collectively toward receiving help.
We do. We really do. Going back to the social worker, I've seen some great social workers pick up the phone and the first thing they say is, I'm from the school division. I'm here to help you. And then they open up the conversation with getting them to ask first, what are things that the schools can help you? And they let them know point blank, they're not to get them in trouble, because they understand it's not a situation of where it's an assault, but it's truly an economic hardship that they're going through. Homelessness, for a perfect example. Some families, some parents will think that they're going to take their children away because they're homeless. And that's quite different. It's so far from the truth. That situation, the social worker wants to create and make sure that that child not only is getting a good meal in school, but also keeping everything as stabilized as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Homeless children can be transported even if they're not in that school zone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a federal law. It's called the McKinney-Vento law.
Mm-hmm.
They have a responsibility as a school division to ensure that those children are getting the best education possible and keeping their environment as consistent as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they get back on their feet, then they take away some of the layers of support, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And yeah, and so it just seems like that it's going to be a process to get people to buy into this. Which I think you highlighted in the book too, the process of getting buy-in from people.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
The buy-in has to be from everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times society, social media focuses on the negative aspects of things, or they
Yes.
focus on the glamorous things.
Yes.
And they fail to realize there's heroes in the classes and the schools, just like there's families at home that are heroes just keeping things together.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to communicate and extend what opportunities and resources they can be receiving while they're trying to get everything back together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so how would your vision, like your ideal vision of schools, how would that really boost emotional and mental support? Because let's say that this is a go at some point,
Mm-hmm.
and you get the go ahead to do something like this in the school systems. Traumatized communities, because some communities are more traumatized than others. So when you get into traumatized communities, what type of extra added support would you recommend bringing in that interim to help these recovering communities with not just socioeconomic recovery, but mental and emotional recovery as well?
Schools need to be thought more than just middle school kids or high school kids. Schools should be served as a community hub where multiple levels of service can be provided. I'm not talking about like hospital-like services, but if they need treatment and they need services, they need to learn about jobs because they're unemployed. They need to have therapy there from a licensed school professionals. And they need to create value-added relationships between the parents and the kids. The schools have the structure to make that happen. But what they have to do is be able to have an open door where they're allowed to do that, let's say after hours, let's say on weekends, when we know that there's moments of crisis that they're going to need those levels. They feel like schools can only do but so much. No, schools can do so many things, but we have to think beyond just a traditional brick and mortar book sense. We have to think about as a whole self-serving citizen approach.
Mm-hmm.
Having those therapists in the buildings are not only going to help parents, but they're also going to help the children as well. I think we also have to make sure that there's more than enough services provided. There's way for kids to channel that frustration into something positive. For some, it could be as therapeutic as creating art. For some, it could be just having a workout room where they're going to lift weights or jog or do something like that. For those, it's having access to a library where they can read. For some, it's just being able to talk through situations.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the availability to gather that knowledge and share it and convey it so that they are able to hopefully cope through those situations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, And I love the idea of having the school be like a community hub. And I really liked some of the ideas that you put in the book. And I think some schools are doing this. I don't think enough. And the schools that are doing it, I think they could probably expand this more. You see it more in colleges with, internships, or what do they call them? Like where you collaborate and you get like the 6-month paid internship.
Right. It's
what do they? Co-ops. Thank you. I couldn't think of co-op. The only thing I could think of was collaborate. Yeah. So internships and co-ops. I love the idea of really bringing that into the high schools and even possibly into the middle schools. So can you talk a little bit about that and about that vision? Because I think that, like I said, there are some schools that are doing it and some schools that are just trying to hold it together, let alone implement something like that.
As a school system, or I should say as academia, we feel like we should be preparing our kids for the next level in terms of skills, but we also miss the boat when it comes to getting kids hooked into something. And we have to do more than just those one-day career days where they come in, or maybe they'll check out a fire truck. You have to have them feel like they are a part of that building, just like you would for services, therapeutic services, or job improvement sites, certifications. You have to create basically a hub of information for kids where they can just go in like they're getting a cup of coffee and being able to talk to a recruiter, or listening to somebody virtually who's an engineer in California talking about additive manufacturing. Or how cool would it be talking to an astronaut, how their job differs than they were being a pilot? The more we can make it at their availability and you ingrain it into the curriculum, the more you're going to get kids hooked into these things. That's the secret to learning now, is not force feeding it, but getting them to want it, to make that hunger self-driving, that they are wanting to come to school every day and they want good grades, and they understand that there's a lot of preparation that they have to do, not only when they graduate from high school or college, but even as current employees. Every day, I think something should be highlighted. I think a career should be highlighted every day.
Okay.
And whether it's through the announcements, whether it's through the boards, you're pumping it through social media, something should be highlighted every day so that hopefully one kid will at least be hooked from it, and they understand this is what they've got to do and this is what they need to begin that journey.
Okay. And another question I have about the book, I did notice that, kind of like in the ideal scenario that every kid would graduate and either go into the military, get a job, or go to college, one of the three. What about people who don't want any of those paths for themselves? Or what about the person who wants to become a professional artist, or wants to start their own business, which is not technically the same thing as having a job?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's a combination of those things.
Okay.
The entrepreneur, for example, if they're going into business, they have to understand that there's accounting practices that have to be done. For an artist has to understand that there's marketing that needs to be done with their products. It could be online, so they would need a little bit of web understanding. It could be creating brochures. It could be marketing it. And the thought behind it is you don't just stop after high school. You still have to get some sort of additional training. And in the perfect world, I don't think we need degrees anymore. I think we need the courses that provide us with the skills and the experiences to give us the opportunities to achieve the careers we want.
And you just answered one of my questions. So thank you. Because I was going to ask about college degrees, because there is this push that, is college even as relevant as it was, 20, 30, 40 years ago? You get people with bachelor's degrees who can't get a job better than, fast food in some areas. Yeah.
That's another sad reality we're in.
Mm-hmm.
In America, as I'm sure in potentially other countries, society has been brainwashed to think that 4-year degrees are better than 2.
Mm-hmm.
And to an extent, that is true. We're talking about doctors. We're talking about aerospace engineers. We're talking about the really technical level of fields.
Mm-hmm.
But now that certifications have come out and you're able to be endorsed from a 2-year degree, like an associate's degree, you will find out that they're going to be making just as much, if not more money than somebody that comes out with a 4-year degree.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading somewhere, they call it a 7-to-1 ratio. And they say for every particular profession, and I'll pick a physician, for example, there's so many nurses that they need. You have to have an IT person. You have to have an office manager. And it's that supports that are neglected because people have been focused on those 4-year degrees. And that's why you're seeing such a pay spike in those jobs, because
Mm-hmm.
they want them to have those skills to be on the job force today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, fantastic. And I have another question that's kind of related, but kind of not. Whenever you think about some of the, I don't know, what teachers consider to be problem behaviors in schools,
Mm-hmm.
like bullying or that child. And like, I know a lot of people in my life who their entrepreneur showed up early in childhood. And my sister is one of those people. Like, she would find a way to sell things to her friends at school, and, like selling things on the playground or in the parking lots or whatever. And so whenever you see these types of behaviors, a lot of times the kids get in trouble for selling things at school, or they get in trouble because they're bullying, and because they are on, like, I'm going to use some psychological terms that I work with, more on the shadow side of it,
Yes.
operating more on more from that trauma perspective rather than from, how can I take control of this? So how would you take those behaviors? Because even the bully, there is some sort of strength that a bully has, and they channel that strength to beat down other people rather than use it effectively and turning it into a strength. So how would you address that kid? Do you see what I'm saying? Or how can you encourage the entrepreneur rather than punish them and get them to shift their behavior so they can still build and become an entrepreneur and not turn away from it? Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense.
Because some of those punishments can really derail people from their talents and their gifts.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's go to the example where your sister is an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
I think of 2 scenarios immediately. One is if a school has a bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
give them the experience of how an inventory works at a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
Get them to be able to do the books for the day and then be able to submit it to the bank, if you will, how a teacher would actually record the deposit slips and record it. Get them to market it and then spin it into something that they want to do. Have the conversation with your sister. What is it that you want to do as an entrepreneur? And they'll be like, I want to be an artist. Perfect. So that's when you would take those moments and you make sure that they have the right courses in their schedule lined up, and you pair them with a mentor, whether it's inside or outside the building, so that those fruits come to life and they have the chance to really develop and get rooted into their dreams.
Yeah.
When it comes to the bully situation, there's usually a backstory behind it. And a lot of times they're not going to tell you, and you're kind of throwing darts at the wall, and sometimes you hit it. But you have to focus on that situation and make them realize what they're doing is wrong. At the same time, you have to ensure that the parents are supporting what's going on at the school. They have to be able to see it from the school's perspective, from the child's perspective, and you have to explain to them, if we don't correct this course, this is what could easily happen. And
Right.
it's that dangerous line where it could turn into, heaven forbid, a domestic assault case because they think it's okay to push people around. Or
Yes.
it could turn into something, let's say, eventually could be charged strong arm robbery because their
Right.
friend didn't want to give them $5 to go get a drink.
Right. And there are careers in life where that stoicism and that ability to really just down on your emotions whenever you're getting yelled at or screamed at or in the face of horrible adversity, where that can be a strength and where that's required for the job. And so, like, there has to be a way to kind of channel those strengths away from the bullying and the harming of other people into a career path where where they can really pull on their strengths.
Right.
And I can share a little tiny snippet. I did grow up in a lot of adversity. I came out of childhood. There's a test called the ACE test, Adverse Childhood Experiences. I came out of childhood with a 9 out of 10 on my ACE.
Wow.
So I learned from a very, very young age how to be belligerent and tell people off. I have been telling people where to go and how to get there my whole life. And not too long ago, I volunteered at a pretty major conference that had some internationally known speakers. And they put me in a spot as a volunteer where I'm like, oh my God, this is my strength. I'm not on the shadow side of this and I'm not feeling guilty. I was the gatekeeper of the green room. I'm like, what a perfect place.
How cool.
Yeah. So being able to like funnel the crowd away from the I guess personalities. And I've also a strength of mine, which is that having issues with authority. So I don't fall into that starstruck. I look at celebrities, I'm like, yeah, they're just people too. They're probably a jerk just like everybody else. That's kind of my attitude. So not falling into that starstruckness, I wasn't one of those like puppies trying to follow around the personalities who were there. So I'm like, oh my gosh, this would be a great place to put me.
Yeah. And when you talk about the bullies, you're right. I call them hidden skills, hidden opportunities.
Yes.
And once you tap into it, you see some phenomenal leaders that come out of it. And
yes.
That's how you deter them from the path that they're going down.
Mm-hmm.
For some, it could be going into the military and leading people and taking the charge on things, such as fighting drugs if they're in the Coast Guard, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Or they could turn into super salesmen because they have that uncanny knack of knowing that they're going to get shut down sometimes, but they keep thriving. And some of these guys can be phenomenal entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them can be incredible athletes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you're right.
Yeah. And if you can tap into that empathy that we all have within us, if you can break through some of those walls that the trauma builds up and actually get to the empathy within, then they could be really great in, like law enforcement, criminal justice, even military careers. Where it's helpful to have, both sides. Because if you don't have the empathy and you're all one and not the other, then you're more likely to go down that path of PTSD. And, if you don't manage the trauma as you go through life, it builds up.
Right. It really does. And there's times when you have to channel it so that you can kind of let go some of that steam that's built up, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times that you have to keep it under wraps because you don't want to be in the middle of a situation and just implode. So You're right. Knowing that balance is super critical.
Mm-hmm.
And that is another part of education I think teachers need to have, is the understanding that we do have kids with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
We have kids that are emotionally disturbed. We've had kids who've had families mothers, fathers murdered, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And they are traumatized so far and so deep that they'll never recover from it.
Yeah.
But we still have to give them our best.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wouldn't say never. It just might take longer.
True.
Yeah. It's amazing that my life has turned out the way it is, considering what some of the stuff I've been through in the past. So it can happen. It really can. Yeah. And I have a couple other questions to kind of direct back to the book. Pretty much the whole book focused on, like this vision of a school system on an island on St. Andrews. And there was a lot of comparisons to, the school systems on St. Andrews being compared to urban school systems throughout the country. What about the rural school systems? Because there are some similarities, and at the same time in rural school systems, because I grew up in a rural school where I looked out my high school windows and all I saw were cow fields, and that was it. Like, the high school itself wasn't even in town. And so there was no leaving it wasn't even a campus. It was just a building. So there was
Right.
no leaving the building for lunch. It wasn't even an option. You couldn't go to the pizza parlor next door because it didn't exist. So how do you, how does this translate to rural areas?
So many ways. You're going to have impoverished children. You're going to have some of the same scenarios that you would on St. Andrews as you would as an urban school, as in a rural school. There's a lot of common threads, and for picking St. Andrews, we wanted to kind of isolate some of the variables and having it on an island where they're going to be set up for success. When you look at an urban school, there's a lot of things that can happen overnight that could change the dynamics of everything, that totally deter what the focus or the dream of the school is. Rural, same thing. You never know what could pop up in a minute. But if we can make it right in one area and we can perfect it, then we know it can be replicated everywhere. And I think that's the point that I was trying to share with everybody in the book is, yeah, urban's what we typically think, but we really need to think everywhere.
Yeah, and one of the questions I had was, because there was emphasis on really partnering with companies and businesses that are in the area. And when you get into some of the rural schools, those companies and businesses a lot of times are an hour and a half away. At least that was the reality where I grew up. And so would you suggest connecting with some of those companies? They're, like how would you bring that a little closer to home? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're asking.
Because that can be kind of daunting, especially if you get somebody in a rural area who's impoverished and doesn't have a vehicle, and really vehicles are almost necessary in those areas.
So the future work is becoming more and more distance e-commute, if you will. And if I was a school superintendent in a rural county and there was a major corporation maybe an hour away from where I lived, I would pick up the phone, or better yet, I would go there and say, how can we help bring employees to you? How can you help us understand what you need? And you start those conversations. Companies that really see value in the educational systems that they know are producing are going to put more emphasis into it. And it really begins with a good old-fashioned phone call, handshake. And when you bring that together, you then create opportunities. It's being open-minded to new adventures. And that's why I talked about distance learning, but it's distance learning for an internship.
Okay.
If you love math and you want to help with their inventory system and you're an hour away, why not give them a sample Excel sheet that they can't damage and they can see the numbers and work through it? For a company who's looking for ITs, but that rural county teaches coding and programming. Why not get some of those kids to do some of the work remotely, and the distance won't matter at all?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Great idea. I love that. Another thing that you talked about for this ultimate vision of a school is having dormitories for the middle and high school students. And um, and I'll be flat out honest. There were a few times in the book where you referred to it as residential schools, and the connotation that comes with residential schools, especially in North America, tends to have a negative connotation to it.
Yeah.
Whenever you hear the term, I don't think that's gone away, because it took my brain a minute to go, oh, I get what he's talking about. Because when I heard residential schools, I'm like, wait a minute, what? And then I read on a couple more sentences and I'm like, oh, I get what he's talking about here. But there's that initial reaction that we have, just because of how we've been conditioned. So how would you, yeah, do you see what I mean? Like I could see where there would be resistance to the visioning of what you have for a school. And then the other thing that comes to mind, other than residential schools, are boarding schools, which have their own connotation and their own stereotypes to them. And on either side, it's a little bit icky to think about.
This is where social media and the media have skewed things to where reality is sometimes not really what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
When we talk about a residential hall, we want to limit the distractions after school. We want kids to feel safe to learn. We want kids to feel like that they are going to be comfortable and that they're focused on developing themselves as a person. You can only do but so much in 7 hours. It sounds like a lot of time, but kids sometimes want to learn more about jobs, or sometimes kids want to play sports, but they can't because of the neighborhood that they're in. And when you have residential schools in the setting like that, you create chances for them to do things that they're not going to be able to have elsewhere. And that was the point behind recommending that. That's where you can create things like maker spaces and having it in the halls where everybody can come and combine regardless of grade, regardless of age, ability, and you can play just like we as kids used to play at the playground. You would have third graders coming from one neighborhood. You'd have you and a bunch of friends come over with your bikes and just, good old fashioned football game or just being on the swings. It is the collaborative approach so that all opportunities are maximized. And it reassures the parents too, those that have 2 and 3 jobs, that they don't have to worry about wondering, are their kids safe? Are their kids eating a decent meal tonight? And that was the purpose of introducing a residence hall. And it still gives them the flexibility where they could go home on the weekends and not feel confined.
Okay. And do you think parents would buy into that?
I think initially, no.
Yeah,
I think
that's what I'm wondering. I'm thinking that might take a generation.
It will.
To get the parents to buy into it, because I can see parents going, no way. There's so much distrust of other people when it comes to our kids out in the world right now. And it's not necessarily related to the schools, but that distrust of the other that is so prevalent in American society right now, I think is, and I don't know for sure, I don't know for sure, but I would suspect that there would be people who would be resistant to that. Like, no, you're not going to take my kid. You're not going to try to control my kid. This is my kid.
You are. And you're exactly right. You're going to have those that are going to think, all right, it's for the affluent, or there's something wrong and you need to be in a residence hall.
Right.
And it would be making sure that the parents understand fully all the details. They could go visit their children anytime they want. Kids could go anytime they want within reason. Now, obviously, if it's midnight, they don't need to be leaving unless there's an absolute emergency. But marketing it so that the parents realize that this is just an extension of school. And there's availability with that. It could be going to field trips that are 3 hours away that you otherwise can't do during the day.
Mhm.
It could be more opportunities to do internships because the schools have the availability to shuttle the kids to and from the job sites.
Mhm.
It could be tutoring because a lot of times parents don't know how to tutor chemistry or calculus, and they
Right.
have that availability at the residence hall.
Mhm.
And slowly and surely, I think you would win over a lot of people.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I love the idea. I really do think it's a great idea. I just, like I said, I was a little concerned about how the buy-in would be for something like that. Yep.
There's always going to be hesitancy when you're doing something new. And I
Yes.
tell people the only consistent in life is change.
Hmm.
It's how much are you going to invest in yourself and in your family? Do you want to improve at the next level?
Hmm.
You have to be willing to take a risk, but you also have to know that schools want to give them the best.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I really love the forward thinking in the book, because I know that there's a place in the book where, you said that we must examine the problems with America's public schools, and we must think how to avoid traditional solutions because they don't work. Um, and it, and then you said instead our mission is to develop a fresh and exhilarating approach. And that's something that, again, kind of circling back to the beginning of the conversation, I don't care what industry we're talking about. I think that is such an important point, that it's time to start thinking beyond traditional solutions, because how much time have we spent trying to recreate the wheel by putting, band-aids on the holes on the tire?
You're right.
And band-aids aren't going to hold that wheel together anymore. So we have to come up with a whole new material to make the wheel out of.
We do. And
Yeah.
it's not just an American problem.
Hmm.
It really is a global problem. You think about the gender inequality in some countries.
Hmm.
Think about their neurodiverse inequalities and the lack of accommodations they're getting.
Hmm.
It's rare to find school systems that are complete. You've got some that are rocking, like Finland. If
Hmm.
you look at them and they have like a 99% graduation rate,
Hmm.
and they are doing some incredible things. And I think they're probably one of the closest countries to blank check. But of course, there's always improvements that can be made.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Now, I am not familiar with what they're doing. So what are they doing that's close to blank check?
Well, a lot of little things that add up. For example, teachers are getting paid more.
Hmm.
And when you are getting paid more, you're going to get better quality. And
Yes.
I'm not trying to say that the teachers now aren't quality, because they are. It's we're losing good candidates now because we're not getting them because of the salary difference.
That, and it wasn't long after I graduated college that the educational programs pretty much, not, I don't know about all of them, but a lot of them that I was aware of went from 4-year programs to 5-year programs. So you
That's
have
another
an
one.
extra year of student debt in order to get a job where the salaries haven't increased in how long? The starting salaries. It's been the
No,
starting salaries aren't that different than when I graduated 100 years ago.
you're right.
A little
You're
bit, but not enough.
it's in some cases it's barely keeping above
Mhm.
inflation. And the sad reality, this has happened to my wife and myself. We get a pay raise and it's not enough to cover the healthcare change in a year. So we're actually losing money compared to what we had made the last year.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
they don't focus as much on standardized tests.
Mhm.
And I agree with testing to an extent.
And that's an important point.
Yeah, yeah,
Not focusing so much on standardized testing.
right.
Oh my gosh.
We need to focus on process
Hmm.
and product assessment. And it's through the kids' modalities, how they learn, not necessarily a multiple choice test or a short answer test.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how you
Right.
approach these conversations is right now determined by the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
It is much cheaper for a company to assess somebody paper and pencil than it is for them to submit a project.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you have a good quote about that in here, because you said something to the effect of, are the things we suggest going to enhance the quality of teaching and learning, or are we just adding more to our plates so we can check a box? And again, that's kind of reiterating what you just said. And I think that quote is something that can be extrapolated into almost any industry. Look at all the crap that we do in our jobs, regardless of what industry it is, just so we can check a box, not because it's really meaningful or it's really helpful. It's just checking a box.
It really is. Can we say we've done it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And then we focus on the next thing.
Yeah. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, moving on.
Right.
Yeah.
So, hi and bye.
Right. and that approach, you're right, it's not helpful at all. And and I really love the idea of having the schools come back into the center to be a hub of the community. I think in some places that used to be a thing. Some places it might still be a thing, but it's definitely rare compared to what it used to be.
Where I am in Virginia, there are those that call it neighborhood schools.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a compliment, because that means that the school is a part of that community.
Yes.
It basically is part of the lifeline of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And I loved that you highlighted in the book too, getting input from the students themselves. Um, you know, there was a quote in the book where you said, adults have led education for eons and don't let students have any say. If this is going to work, we need a different approach. The students have to have, maybe not the final say, at the same time have input in the direction in which their lives are headed as well. And I bring this up as being super important because it can feed into behavioral problems that we see from our children. When our children, we know that mirror neurons, we know what they are. Initially, they were called empathy neurons, and then they switched the name to mirror neurons once they learned more about them. And children are expected to sit in their seats and mirror the teacher all day with nobody mirroring themselves back to them.
Yeah.
And that is emotionally and mentally exhausting. And then when the kids get home and they're in a place where they feel safe, it's likely the child might throw a tantrum. So it's not uncommon for little kids to come home and have that meltdown as soon as they get home from school. Well, the parents don't know how to take the meltdown. Here it's because the kid feels safe enough to let their emotions out. The parents don't know what to do with it, and then the kid gets in trouble because they melted down. So no matter where they go, they have no safe outlet for these pent-up emotions. So we need adults who can understand how to mirror back to children the light that exists within them instead of expecting it one way only.
And that's why I always share a reminder with the teachers: teach the way you would want to be taught.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just want to sit there and watch 60 PowerPoint slides, or watch a 1-hour movie and with no engagement, no lessons that are going to, what I call drill and kill, bore and snore you to sleep?
Right.
Or are you going to bring it to life? And that's one of the issues that I have, is that we have lost creativity in schools.
Absolutely.
Sir Ken Robinson, he said it best. He said, education is killing creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And he is so far right as far as I'm concerned. And if we can just at least get that back on track, I think we would be able to solve some of the problems about little misbehavior issues and making things fun, developing relationships again, and showing the humanistic side of school and education.
Well, and I think that even that statement was a little too small. I don't think it's the little behavior issues. I think that it can extrapolate into the bigger behavior issues, because creativity, the more we can play with our own creativity, whatever that is. For some of us, it's painting, or actually creating some sort of fine art through paints or sculpture. For others of us, it's like using words and pen and paper, or I have a background in body work, and so just having a gift for seeing where people's bodies are out of places and knowing what to do to help work on that. And same thing emotionally, with people's emotional wellness. And I think it's really, really important to point out that creativity draws our purpose out of us the more we play with it. And when we don't have a purpose in life, or when we don't know what our purpose is, or whenever we let society define our purpose for us instead of letting it emerge from within us, then we are more likely to go down that rabbit hole of traumatized patterns of behavior, rather than letting that gift emerge from within us. So we're more likely to live on the shadow side of behaviors than not.
Yeah.
If we're not creative. And play is the antidote to anger. Plain and simple. Play is the antidote to anger. Rage researchers in the past, psychiatrists who have studied rage, have discovered that the antidote to anger and rage is play. And I think that says a lot about our country right there, if you just think about it.
I do, because that's actually another one of Finland's secrets, is they have more time for exercise, calisthenics, and playtime.
Mm-hmm.
And we are lucky to get 30 minutes a day in an elementary school, 45 minutes every other day in a middle school, when it should be, I think, an hour a day easily doing things, canoeing, hiking, playing a pickup game of basketball.
Yeah.
And that re-stimulates your brain for learning. So when you do sit down, you're not distracted and you feel like you can focus better on it. Mm-hmm. It does. It's like, even now when we're kind of cooped up in our quarantine quarters, and you go out for a walk, how much better do you feel when you come back,
Yeah.
I know I feel good when I get out for 5 minutes and get some fresh air. And it's the same thing for kids. They don't want to be cooped up in a little 2 foot by 3 foot cubicle all day.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it's forcing them to go against their innate nature as a child. And whenever you can't let that innate nature of who you truly are emerge, and you have to hold it in, it's exhausting. And it's emotionally exhausting and mentally exhausting. And it sucks the life out of you.
It does. And it, just like you said, it turns into regret, and then that regret turns into anger. And then that's where you see a whole different child.
Yeah. Yep. Another thing I noticed in your book is that you made many, many references to noticing body language. So I'm assuming that you're trained.
I'm not. No.
Oh, you're not. Okay. Because I've been trained through the Body Language Institute, and I've just started taking classes through the Congruency Group. I'm hoping to get a couple of the creators on the show in the future. So I have studied body language and statement analysis and elicitation and things like that. And it's so important to notice a person's body language. Even though I've been trained by people in the criminal justice system who interrogate the bad guys, I apply it to trauma work, because the body language of somebody who's traumatized is pretty much the same as somebody who's being outright deceptive. The difference is, what you don't know as the person talking to them is whether or not they're subconsciously repressing information or consciously suppressing it. Because if it's repressed, they don't know. They don't necessarily know that they're lying to you. They might believe, you know what I mean? Or maybe the story is 100% true, and their trauma has just made their body language, like slump forward or appear closed off. And so here I made an assumption, because you referred to it so many times, and I know not to assume. But it did. It really seemed like you'd studied body language from as many references that you put in. And I was just curious, what do you feel about pulling that into the curriculum? It's so important for healthy communication to be able to recognize the nonverbal cues.
My daddy used to tell us as a family growing up, pay attention to the details. And when it comes to other people, everybody's talking. You just may not be listening. And it could be body language. It could be physically. And, when you read somebody's emotions, when you read somebody's body language, you then can tell a lot and how to approach them in a better way.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We forget that a lot of times, is that when you see
Right.
somebody, we don't know what's happening to them that day. We don't know if they just got evicted. We don't know if they just found out that their mother's in the hospital.
Right.
You have to take the time to know your children.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to know what makes them work better. And you have to know when you need to re-scoop them back up and embrace them, not physically, but let them know that they're fine, they're human, we're going to get through this together, and
Yeah.
get them those supports.
Yeah.
And body language is one of the best ways that I'm aware of that you can do that.
Absolutely.
Not everybody is going to be able to pick up the little subtleties unless they tell you directly, this is what I'm mad at, or this is why I don't feel good.
That's the thing. I think we do pick up on the little subtleties sometimes, and we talk ourselves out of it because it's like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that meeting went okay, and there's just something that I can't put my finger on. And maybe you were lied to. Maybe something in you noticed that there was an incongruency between the facial expression and the words coming out of their mouth, or the way they were holding their body and what they were saying. So if there are some of those hot spots or tells, if you don't know, if you aren't aware of them, then it's something you can't put your finger on. You just don't know what's wrong. And a lot of times we can talk ourselves out of it. We can talk ourselves out of noticing those little things and then going with the decision that ends up being detrimental in the long run.
It is. It's so true. It's, to me, your conscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell parents, it's your spider sense tingling that something's wrong.
Yeah.
And you always need to stop and listen, even though you don't know what it is. That means your radar needs to be up. You need to be astute. What's going on? Can you look at patterns? Can you establish some things that are accelerators?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
To it. And psychologically speaking, that should be a part of learning.
Yes.
We take a basic, no, but it's true though. We take a basic psychology class in education, and it helps. We take reading in the curriculum. We used to have a technology, which is like the old overhead projectors and things like that. But I do think there needs to be some sort of course where not only current teachers, but future teachers understand the mannerisms vary from culture to culture.
Yes.
And body languages. And what one person may be saying and thinking that their anger, they're mad about, could be quite the opposite in another culture or language. It's just knowing each individual kid and making them feel special.
Exactly, which is why in any body language class that's worth its weight in gold, the very first thing they're going to teach you is baselining, to get somebody's normal baseline behavior. And then the most important thing with body language is to notice somebody's baseline when they're calm and relaxed, and then notice when they deviate from it. And whenever you see clusters of deviations is when something's up. You just don't know if they're consciously aware of it or not.
And that's it right there.
Yeah. And it's so important to notice it, because if you notice it, then you can adjust yourself and ask a question. And you don't even have to point out and say, gosh, I noticed that your body language just changed. You don't even have to say it. You can just ask a question to get information, like, I don't know, what just happened there? Or, or did something shift? I feel like maybe you changed your mind. What happened?
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be, what's wrong, Billy? It's just being like, all right, come on, give a little bit more.
Yeah.
And
how does that land? How does that sit with you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It makes them feel, okay, he's taking the time to care. He's listening. Let me kind of extend a little bit more. Then hopefully the teacher gets a little bit more. And then there's finally what I call the crossing, where you actually get the whole picture. And then you have a connection where hopefully you can resolve the issue, or at least you can empathize / give support for them to get through whatever obstacle that they're facing.
Yeah, Absolutely. Well, Erin, this is a really, really big topic to talk about. Before we wrap up, what did we not touch today that you would like to talk about?
You hit one of the 3 points I'm glad you shared is kids need to be involved when it comes to making decisions in terms of education, because we want this to become ingrained in schools. And there's a difference between talk to and talked with.
Yes.
Because if you feel like you have buy-in, you're going to own it better. And how many times have we seen great businesses do that and we see phenomenal things take off? That's a business practice we should be doing in schools. The second thing is kids can overcome obstacles, but we have to realize and identify what they are to provide them the resources and the access to get out. So the third thing is, in any decision in life, we have to understand that the kids are going to take it to the next level. How are we setting them up for success? And what do we need to do to not only have them at the table discussing schools, society, citizenship, but what resources do we need to accompany it so that when our time is gone, they can continue the momentum that we've started.
Yeah. And I really think that's an excellent point. Just that little snippet of what you said, that kids will take it to the next level. So as a trauma specialist, because that's what I do, I work with developmental and intergenerational issues. So that's all that stuff that really gets into our implicit mind and our implicit memory, which is our subconscious. It's not within our conscious awareness. So whatever gets imprinted into that subconscious mind or that implicit mind within the first 7 to 8 years of life, the kids will take it to the next level as they grow older. So whatever impression we leave upon them, whether it's a positive impression in the kid's mind or a negative impression in the kid's mind, they will continue with it until somebody helps them learn otherwise. And I think it's excellent that, that all these ideas that you have to shift that and turn it around, because I think we're starting to see, even with the opioid crisis, heck, with the COVID pandemic, let's talk about the opioid, epidemic that we're having. I think that is telling as to how badly we are failing our children.
Well, not only for children, but for adults too. That is an incredible crisis. Sadly, people have lost lives because they've never figured out that there's a way out of whatever that they're into. And we have to recognize that this is one of the bigger issues in American society is drug overdose. And, what's a great way to share it into a story and showing that they've overcome it. And recognizing that if people can overcome it, anybody can overcome it. It's just how committed you are to driving it.
Yes, it is. And it's easier. I don't even remember who said this. It's easier to raise healthy children than it is to fix troubled adults or something like that. I can't even remember who the quote came from.
Frederick Douglass said,
yes,
it's easier to train a child than to fix an adult.
Okay, I knew it was something along those lines. So thank you for correcting me on that. Actually, was that in the book? Did you put that in your book?
I think I did.
I can't remember, but that quote comes to my mind so often whenever I think of our school system, because if our school system would implement even a fraction of some of the things that you've suggested, I think we could do that. I think we could raise healthier kids instead of trying to fix adults more.
Well, that's my prayer in all this, is that we all can do something to improve.
Yes.
And we try to help our children's teachers because we get it. We know that they're struggling just like a lot of teachers across the country are struggling. And that's what I want to do, is raise awareness and raise hope that we're going to do this, but we can't do it alone. We cannot work in our silos. It has to take a unified and viral approach to really elevate the awareness to success.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, we are pretty close to being out of time, Aaron. Do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners today?
Thank you for having me, first of all, on your show.
You're
love
welcome.
talking to you. It feels like I've known you for years, actually.
I know. We've had 2 conversations, right?
I know.
It does.
But it does.
Yeah.
It really does. Thank you for having me, first of all. Really appreciate it. Truly an honor. Second of all, I encourage everybody to keep talking and don't stop the conversation. No idea that you have is dumb. And I remind parents, it's probably some of the most brilliant things. We just need it brought to our attention. And continue to focus on making our children a success.
Yes, that is so important for people to speak up and say what they need or where the gaps are, because if they don't speak up, how do we know?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. And for all of our listeners, this is Jennifer Whitacre, and you've been listening to Yes and. You can find me on YouTube. I'm on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. I'm out there in a lot of different places, so please subscribe. Please share this with your friends and your family, because that'll give me a little boost. And I think if people reach out and check out Aaron's book, Blank Check. Aaron, you said that's released already, or is it coming?
It'll be released as an ebook on Amazon May the 5th.
Okay.
And paperback is September the 8th.
Okay. Awesome. So September 8th is paperback, and the ebook will be out in just a couple days. So and I'll put some information up in the show notes on how you can get a hold of that ebook, because it really is a good book and I highly recommend it. So thank you for being here, and please share this episode. There's a lot of good information. Have a wonderful day, and I will see everybody next week.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.